Right, hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's video. And today we are going to cover the HDMI pin-out for the newer CUH-1200 series PlayStation 4, or those commonly known to have the SAC-001 motherboard revision motherboard in them. And these are something that I've started seeing more of. Like I say, I'm more or less a hobbyist in this kind of thing, but even the small sample that I look at, sort of this last 4 to 6 weeks or so, I've noticed have been predominantly 1200 series PlayStations. So it's come to that point where, of course, the older ones, the oldest 1200 series consoles are going to be around the 15-month-old mark now, coming out of warranty, and these are going to start hitting the independent repair community. If you haven't already noticed that, certainly within sort of like the next couple of months, we're going to be seeing a lot of them. Now, some of you may know we have one of the more useful instructional videos on this channel is the HDMI pin-out for the older 1100 series PlayStation 4 with the SAA and SAB revision motherboards. That video is still available and it is found below. I'll pop it in the description for you if you want to take a look at that. And what that actually shows you is where the various pins on the HDMI port actually connect to out into the rest of the motherboard. So to give you an idea as to what this video actually is about, if you don't know what a pinout is you will notice that on your HDMI port, if you come to replace it, it's actually soldered into the motherboard at the rear of the port. So there's 19 pins on that port, and at the back of the HDMI port there are 19 tiny little pins, 19 tiny little feet that are actually soldered onto the motherboard. And what those pins actually are is they're soldered onto pads. And the pads actually connect those little tiny feet and the pins inside the HDMI port to the rest of the circuit on the motherboard. So why do we need this video then? Okay, because those pads are there, all we do is solder them on, right? Well, that's right, yeah, that's cool. But more often than not, inexperienced repairers can actually fall foul of some simple guidelines and some simple basics to actually replacing these ports, and what they can actually do and what they commonly do, usually through no fault of their own. It's usually because of the kit they use. It's usually something like an IOE or a clone of that, so like a whip or a WEP or some cheap Chinese 968 plus station or something like that, which doesn't actually have the gumption to actually get enough oomph and enough heat into the board to reflow the HDMI solder joints properly. And the thing is that those ports are situated on big ground planes, which effectively acts as a massive heat sink to the rest of the board, and actually will draw the heat away from where we're applying it. So you need a decent air station to actually get that heat built into the board and into the solder joints so the port can come free easily. But what happens is that people sort of think, well, I've got it on 500 degrees, all right, it's going to get hot. And after a couple of minutes of wearing their IOE wand around the board, and of course this port's not coming out, right? But I've been heating it for a couple of minutes. So people get impatient and get a pair of tweezers or a pair of mole grips or something, equivalent, and actually yank the port out of the board. And what happens then is the port comes free, but unfortunately it pulls a lot of the connective pads, which those little pins on the back of the HDMI port solder to, out of the board. And it can also pull the traces that those are connected to out of the board, and therefore you end up with a big hole in your board. And you'll notice that if you actually then go to try and resolder your new port in, you'll notice you can't actually get any solder to adhere to those pads that you've actually lifted out of the board. And that's a bad sign, right? Because what do you do then? Well, you plug it into your TV, and I've no doubt you'll notice you either get no picture, or you'll get snow, or you'll get a solid blue screen, solid green screen, solid red screen, or something like that. Now, occasionally you can get lucky. There are things called not connected pads, or NC, which you may know that they're referred to as. There's only one of those on a PlayStation, and that's pin 14. That's an unused pin, which is part of the HDMI specification for some future expansion purposes. If you pull that pin, doesn't matter. You could get lucky and pull that pin. You won't notice any difference. If you pull one of the ground pins, or a series of the ground pins, as long as you've still got one or two there, you should be fine. Because what you'll notice is that those are the pads there that are easier to lift out the board. And the main reason for that is because they don't commonly have anything, they don't have any internal traces anchoring them into the board. They're usually just part of the top layer of the board. And so those pads are commonly just epoxied in, and those are quite easy to lift out if you're not careful. But again, providing you only take 1 or 2 out, you're probably going to be fine, right? So you could get lucky. But in the event you haven't, and the ones that more commonly come out are the ones that are connected through to the EMI filters across from the HDMI encoder ICs, the ones on the little traces. So you'll notice that on some of the pins the lines run back through some little holes on the older boards and go underneath. And from the underneath they've onto these little 4 tiny cube looking things, and those are the EMI filters then into the Panasonic HDMI encoder IC. So those are the ones that people commonly lift out and rip. So what do? Because if you can't solder those pins back because there's nothing there to solder them to, surely you're stuffed. Well, no, because that's what the HDMI pin-out is for, you see. Because what the pin-out will show you is where that pad that used to be on your board that you've lifted out actually goes to. So that pad that you've lifted out connects that pin on your HDMI port to the next part of the circuit, right? It's basically just like a roadway, if you like. You've got your house, you want to go to the supermarket, you need to go down the road, okay? All that pad does is actually connect you to the roadway so you can get from your house to your supermarket. Of course, if somebody comes and blows your road up or digs it up, what can you do? Well, you could build a new road, right? And you can still get to the supermarket. And that's effectively the very bad analogy, I'll admit, but that's the analogy we're working to. So effectively what we're going to show you next is a series of images which will show you from pins 1 through to pins 19, because there's 19 pins on the HDMI port, and it will show you exactly where you need to solder from and to. So what you will do is you will create something called a link wire, which goes between the pin on your HDMI port, which is where you would solder that pin to the pad normally, but the pad isn't there. So what you do is you run a wire from the pin on your HDMI port across to the point on these diagrams that I'm going to show you in a sec, okay? So you go from the pin on the HDMI port to the location shown on these diagrams, directly to it. So you solder a wire from the pin directly to the component I'm going to show you, and on the side of the component that's indicated on these diagrams coming up. And if you do that, you effectively rebuild that roadway we were talking about in that really bad analogy earlier on, and it will actually restore the output to your PlayStation. So rather than either having to replace the motherboard and it being a complete nightmare and quite expensive, to be in a couple of quid and 5 minutes to sort of solder a link wire in there. Now there are a couple of tips for you for this, and again we do have a video a little bit further down, and I'll pop this in the description as well, which shows you how to run a link wire. If you don't know, there's also a useful video in there for how to solder to vias, and I'll pop that in the description as well. The vias are the tiny little holes. So we were talking earlier that if you look on the HDMI port, you'll see some pins that run back across some little lines in the board, and then they go to some holes and they disappear. That's it. They stop at these holes. Those holes are vias, and those are internal pathways. So your PlayStation motherboard is made of several layers that sandwich together. Okay, so a via actually connects these individual layers in the sandwich together. So effectively, those are a bit of a bitch to solder to because they're covered in epoxy and everything else. They're actually protected, and for good reason. So that video will show you how to prepare and solder to those because they're easily damaged. And if you damage those, again, you may not be stuffed, but it's just more work and it's just a bit of a pain in the backside to try and get it working again. So, just watch those videos. If you've damaged, a pathway to a via, just watch how to, prepare a via for soldering. Follow it and you'll be fine. And like I say, we're going to show you these images now. So, as far as running a link wire goes, it's easy enough, right? If you watch the other video, you'll see what I mean. But there's a couple of things you're going to need before you start. Obviously, you're going to need a fine tip soldering iron because the pins on the back of that HDMI port are incredibly small. If your eyesight's not brilliant, you're going to need some form of magnification. Now, I'm quite lucky in as much as I've sort of invested the best part of $1,000 on a microscope, okay? But you don't need to do that. But some form of magnification is useful if, you struggle a little bit with your eyesight, because those pins are bloody small, even for people like me who've got 20/20, okay? So, it's difficult. but it can be done without. But if your eyesight's not great, you are going to need some form of magnification just to help yourself, because the pins are really fine pitch and the wires are small as well. You're also going to need some solder, obviously, and the usual stuff like flux. You're also going to need to pick up something called magnet wire. Now, magnet wire, and we'll pop an image of magnet wire in there at the moment. Magnet wire, also commonly known as enameled wire, transformer wire. Effectively, it looks like it's unsheathed wire. It looks like it's bare exposed copper wire. And you think, what the bloody hell are you going to do with that? You're going to short everything out, right? No, it's got a little enamel coating on the surface of the wire there, so it is actually insulated, but you can actually see the internal core of it, which is really quite cool. So all you do is you melt the end of the enamel insulation off with the end of your soldering iron, and you'll notice the end of it tins up quite nicely, but the rest of the wire is not conductive because it's covered in this enamel coating. It's really nice stuff. And then best thing about it is, because you're working at the back of a HDMI port where the pins are incredibly fine pitch, if you try to use something like kynar wire, or wrapping wire is more commonly known, even though the sheathing, the rubber sheathing on the outside, the PVC coating on the edge of the wire is really thin, it's so bloody small behind that back of that HDMI port that even that's too thick. And if you've got a couple of pins next to each other, that insulation, even as small as something on, say, 30 gauge kynar, is still too wide. The wire is still too big. So the nice thing about enameled wire or enameled wire or transform wire, whatever you want to call it, is that it doesn't actually have any physical PVC shrouding or coating. It's just an enameled coating on it. It's lovely stuff for doing this with. It's perfect because, of course, what you need is something at least 36 gauge. I use 36 gauge. To be honest, you could probably do with a little bit smaller. 38 is probably perfect. But I like 36. But 38 is probably the sort of optimal one that I'd recommend, just to give you that little bit more room on really tight ports. So yeah, you're going to need some of that. I'll try and pop you a link to some in the UK in the description below, but you can get it from most sort of like electronics parts suppliers. So in the UK, Farnell, CPC, Element 14 in the US. I think we've now got Element 14 here in the UK. DigiKey, places like that. Those people will have this stuff by the bucket loads. You might be able to find it in places like Maplin on the high street, maybe, but be prepared to pay for it from there. You're also going to need something called a conformal coating or an overcoat PCB pen. And again, we've got an image of one of those just coming up into the main description, on the main window now. And what that does is that actually insulates the job once you've completed it. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing a repair without actually using that stuff. And this stuff's really quite nice on several levels. And that's because the HDMI circuit is actually quite particular because, of course, if you've lost the pad that the pin on the HDMI port anchors to, when you plug a lead in or it moves about, the actual pin isn't anchored to the board anymore. Alright, you've run your link wire and that's now connected in circuit to where it needs to go, but it's not actually physically anchored anywhere, okay? So it can move ever so slightly. And that can, it won't matter because once your PlayStation's in place, right, and it's plugged in your telly, it doesn't move. So once it's plugged in, it's fine. But for the professionalism of it, if you use conformal overcoating pen, what it actually does is it's a form of epoxy resin, and it actually has insulative properties. So not only does it stop your new joints and the actual wires ever from being shorted out. So remember, it's enameled wire, okay? But if somebody came across and scraped it, or you scraped it as you put it back in the shielding, for example, you could it's difficult and you probably wouldn't, but there's the potential there that you could end up shorting your repair out, okay? What that will ensure is that it's quite hard wearing as well, so it will ensure that you can't really do that. So it's a good idea to do it, and it also bonds your repair into the board, so it effectively glues it nicely into place, okay? Now, some people have run slugs of hot glue over it. I shake my head when people do that, to be honest, because it's a bloody nightmare. And I wouldn't recommend using anything like hot glue to try and bond things into position, because all hot glue does, it doesn't stick particularly well to the resin on the main board. Actually, it tends to break off, but then of course it bonds quite well to the wires. So all you end up doing effectively is having a big weight onto your wires, which now aren't secured anymore. But they've got this big weight hanging off them, and when you move it around, or you say you're a shop and you put it back in shipping to the customer, by the time it gets there and it's been bounced around a mail van, it's probably going to come off with your wires. And then your customer's going to ring up and go, "It don't bloody work. What have you done to it?" So yeah, don't use hot glue. If you can help it, don't. Super glue again is another one. Super glue is not going to do anything for you. But this stuff's really nice. So it just finalizes, it just glues everything nicely down to the board. It makes everything look really nice and professional as well. That's the other thing that I really like, particularly if you're a business doing this. It's going to look really nice. So once you've run your wires and you've popped this stuff over the top, it makes it look really nice and professional. It looks like you've cared about what you're doing. It looks like you know what you're doing. Okay, it's a professional looking job. And the thing is, also, that it has like a twofold effect, because once people open it up in future and they see it, one, it looks really good. Okay, so they may not know who's done it, but it looks really good. Secondly, is that it's obvious it's not supposed to be there. Okay, so it makes people think, aha, here be dragons. I'm going to be careful of that. I'm not going near it. Okay, so if they open it up for a completely unrelated issue, they look at it and go, yeah, I'll be careful of that. Which is always cool, because of course anybody goes, touches it, and knackers it up, then it's going to be a bit of a pain in the arse. If in future, say you break your HDMI port again, you want to get that stuff off, well, it usually comes off with a bit of heat, and then you can just wick it up with a bit of IPA and a cotton bud and whatnot. So it is reversible if you need to get it off. So it's not too bad. So yeah, I quite like it for those levels. And as I say, the nice thing is that it bonds everything back down to the board and keeps it there. So I'm going to show you a couple of photographs as well of a job I did not so long back, which was done. A guy had actually replaced a port and had to run some link wires. Yeah, they were run really badly, and then of course, there was snow and artifacting on the display. It was like, oh, I think it might be the encoder. Actually, all it was the port replacement was actually really bad, and the link wires he'd run were terrible. He'd used hot glue on those as well, as you'll see. The hot glue, as I've said, didn't stick very well to the lacquer and the conformal coat on the PCB. It actually lifted and tugged a few of the wires off. Not that they were very well soldered to begin with, by the looks of things. So that probably explains the snow. So we repaired it. I repaired it properly, and I'll show you the before and after. And that worked absolutely beautifully afterwards. No encoder IC required, just the port and the port rebuild from the HDMI pin-out doing properly. And everything looked really nice, and everything worked great afterwards. So take your time. The other tip that I've got for you is to make sure that your wires are run as short as possible to the target. So from the pin to where they need to go in the shortest way. Don't sort of snake it all over the bloody place. Obviously take it around components and things. You don't want to be running wires over components and things like that. But try and keep the pathway as logical and as short as you can. And the other thing, of course, is to try not to cross wires where you can. So don't sort of run them over the top of each other, and you generally want to keep them as far away from each other as you can, in a logical laid out order, just to avoid interference and crosstalk and things like that. Now, anything like that may very well interfere with your picture and may ruin your experience slightly. So yeah, try to do that. So those are the tips I've got for you. As I say, if you watch the videos down below, you'll see what I mean, and hopefully that'll get you going. So onto the diagram, and onto pin 1. So we'll show you pin 1 through to pin 19. Remember, you're going from the pin on the HDMI port as indicated out to directly to the component, and the side of the component is indicated on the images. So the image will show you the pin on the HDMI port and then the corresponding location on the board that you need to solder to. Okay, well, good luck with your HDMI repair. Sorry it's had to come to you needing to run a link wire. It's a bit of a pain, but it's not the end of the world, as you'll see. And in theory, you could lift all 19 pins out and resolder them all nicely. It'd be a pain in the arse and it'd take you forever, but you can do it. So thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, as I say, thank you for watching. I know I've been away for a while. I've been really busy, obviously with the new family, and I've been away on my holidays and stuff in November. Work and everything else. I've been getting my little daughter christened and everything. It's been a nightmare. But hopefully I've got a few more bits and pieces to do. Got some more PlayStations to look at. I have a video following up on the Xbox One hard disk drive format, and there's some common issues that people run into. I've actually got 4 Xbox Ones that need hard drive transplants. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to prepare the hard disks, and then we're going to install them in real time. We're going to go through exactly what happens, because you do have to fight with them occasionally. On the video that we show, it actually goes through first time, which is amazing considering it was on camera. But more often than not, you do run into sort of like you have to fiddle with it a little bit. So we're going to go through that. So that'll be fine. That'll be fun, and hopefully that'll answer a few of the common ones that people stumble across and sort of struggle with on that. So hopefully that'll do that. Like I say, we've got some more PlayStation stuff to look at. I've got an SAC I need to replace an encoder IC on, which is a QFN package, which is a real bitch to solder if you're not used to it. So we'll go through the proper techniques to resolder the QFNs and things like that. So yeah, we've got plenty of stuff coming up. I want to do a H.2 tutorial, which is data recovery for Xboxes and PlayStation hard drives. Which is really cool if you've got a crash disk and it's stopping your machine starting up. Again, we've done a similar thing on the black screen, green screen of death, but we didn't actually show the hard disk repair. We used HDD Regenerator on that video, but H.2 is a nice freeware alternative. It's still in development as well, which is cool. So we'll show you how to use that. Yeah, and I've got a few other bits and pieces to do as well. So we've got plenty coming up. So through December we should have a fair few videos. I know in November we didn't actually have any, which I didn't realise until I looked the other day. I thought, shit. But but anyway, so we'll be back with a nice, decent content flow, hopefully through December and into the new year. So thanks for watching, boys and girls. As always, please comment, rate and subscribe the video, and I'll see you on the next one. So it's ta-ta from me, and good luck with your HDMI repair. We'll get our scope camera back in. So those are our encoder IC filters there. The pins on the bottom row. It's a bit awkward at an angle, this one. On the right hand side, on the top, and on the left. Okay, those all look okay. So let's go back topside then and re-measure that resistor.